Welcome to another episode on how to break into tech. Today we have David Alonso, who is going to share his experience with us, going from venture capital, banking before, moving to a very hot startup, and then founding his own company called Thinko. So thank you so much, David, for being here today with us. And thank you so much for helping other people navigate the very tough world of accessing the workforce. So thanks again. And let's move into the first question, which is, tell us a little bit about yourself and how is this all transitions from banking to venture capital and then startup and everything that you have done.
Thank you for inviting me. So first, I'm a mathematician by background. From there, I actually went into investment banking at Morgan Stanley, but the only good thing I got out of there was my wife. And I moved very quickly on into venture capital, a firm that was called Pata, because I wanted to be closer to technology, to entrepreneurship. But basically there, I realized that I didn't want to be on the investor side. I actually wanted to be on the operator side. Went as sort of the first employee at a company called Dija, which was acquired by GoPuff.
Okay.
And there basically scaled the 360 positions sort of across the company. And then last year, I decided to move on and build my own business.
Great. Amazing. Congratulations. Tell us a little bit about your business, the one that you have just built.
So we're doing an AI-enabled roll-up, which essentially what it means is we, on the one side, we buy distribution. So we buy companies that are currently doing sort of tax and accounting services that are SMEs, sort of like between 10 and 25 employees. And then on the other side, on the build side, is we actually introduce AI to completely transform the unit economics and the actual service of the business that we give to clients, basically with technology to actually improve those margins and to actually be able to really sort of go from a very reactive service to a more proactive services. The whole thesis is basically there's some industries that are very mission critical, like it is tax, accounting, payroll. Every single company actually needs them. The reality is that currently they're actually being served by a lot of really small SMEs, and it's a very fragmented market, which actually leads to basically a very, let's call it subpar experience. Because imagine it's a 10, 15 sort of people, tax and accounting firm that is actually giving you the service. And therefore, one, they cannot really sort of invest on talent to actually bring the best people to give that service. And then secondly, they cannot really sort of invest in technology, in processes to be able to actually sort of be at the frontier and actually basically sort of like serve those companies in a much more efficient, speedy way. And what you find at the end of the day is that they end up doing a lot of really manual, very repetitive tasks that today with AI, there's a huge wave that you can completely, first of all, expand the margins because you can actually sort of like lower the cost and actually serve more clients. But secondly, actually give them a much better experience.
Okay, great. Congratulations on that. Going back to your experience, tell us a little bit about the difference between working at, for example, Morgan Stanley to moving into something growing like Dija and then acquired by GoPuff.
Yeah, so I think actually there's three differences. So the first one, if you think about investment banking, it's a professional services firm, very structured, very big. The second one is venture capital, which is the investing world. And then you go into sort of like operating actual industry experience. So it's like probably the three type of sort of like career buckets that you can actually have. When you're talking about professional services, especially to like large cap companies, which is what investment banking actually is, what you realize is you're working with larger companies. And therefore, by default, everything needs to be sort of like very polished. And therefore, you gain a lot of sort of methodology, you gain a lot of, let's call it process, a lot of attention to detail. However, when you go into sort of like more into the investment side, it's the complete opposite. Like at the end of the day, you still need to be sort of have a lot of attention to detail, but it's sometimes much more, especially in the pre-seed seed, about moving fast, about having the right network, about all of the other skills that you do not develop sort of when you're in the professional services industry, especially serving large cap, because now you're working with founders.
Yeah.
And that's much more than sort of having the best process or the best methodology. At the end of the day, like every single founder is completely unique and they're at a stage where you need to compete and to compete, you actually need that speed. And then when you move into sort of like the operating side, I think the biggest sort of difference that I saw was you switch from in investing, everything is very external focused. So you spend 90% of your time with people that are not within your organization, within your own actual venture capital fund. You spend most of your time with founders, other funds, other business angels. Like you're building your brand, you're building your network. And it's amazing because you basically get to explore and expand your network massively. But it's very sort of, to an extent, a little bit high level because therefore you cannot sort of really go deep in any of those relationships necessarily, or it's harder. However, when you switch into operating, it's the complete opposite. Now you spend 90% of your time with internal teams, with your marketing team, with your tech team, with your product team, solving problems inside the business.
Yeah.
And it's very, very different. So it's like a completely switch of mentality, of
mindset,
how do you go from a very sort of like external facing type of role to a very internal facing, spending a lot more time sort of with people that you're working to solve a specific problem, and going very, very deep to the point of like, what's the price of a banana in the case of Go, which is a...
That's good. Going back to your early years, how do you remember your job searching and your job hunting? Did you know what you wanted to do, or did you discover it with time? And how did you approach the new opportunities?
So the first job, which was sort of investment banking, it was basically because they told me, hey, you're going to make a lot of money and you're going to do very cool deals. And I was like, okay, this sounds cool. Then what you realize is sort of on an earnings per hour, probably you don't earn that much.
No.
And then secondly, you're not really sort of doing any sort of external contact with the actual company until you're very sort of like further on in your career. So the job searching also for those opportunities, much more sort of like scaled companies with a lot of processes, was very different.
Okay.
I think they only share one thing in common, which is if you really want to be sort of at the best companies in whatever you want to do, is you need to hack the process. You need to understand the process. You need to understand the incentives on the other side of the table and hack it. In the case of investment banking, it was very clear. Like they have very clear processes, and you actually had to basically speak with people that had done them relatively soon on the internet. And for example, for investment banking, there was this guide that you would study it, which is basically, it was called How to Break into Wall Street.
Yeah.
And every single question that you could get from an investment bank,
He would train you.
It was basically like a copycat. Like you would get one of those questions entirely. So it was more about like understanding
the process.
How do you hack the process?
Yeah, like how do you break the GMAT, for example?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then and then that hacking is very similar thing in sort of any sort of like job search, but it just requires much more different skills. Here it's more like sort of like studying a guide, making sure you understand sort of like the type of questions what they're going to look at the CV, and how can you actually differentiate yourself versus everybody else that's actually applying and what they're actually looking for.
Yeah. From a scale from 1 to 10, how fundamental was you were starting the career in finance to take the next steps after?
I think it was good, not because of finance, probably because you had a good stamp on your CV. So actually it could open some doors. It was like, hey, at least this kid like has done something, and I think like people still care about stamps, so I guess you could get some doors open. But in terms of the actual skills
that you develop, it's not fundamental at all.
I've never used them at all.
It has changed a lot in the past 10 years, what they have now. I mean, the market is much more attractive, and other companies that have been growing, rather than when we were at uni, you had very less options. You had the classic banking, the classic consultancy, but the extension of the tech world and the startup ecosystem was not even half of what we have now.
Totally. So I think the talent pool has completely changed. And I think there's still a long way. I think there's a lot of white space to change. I think still, at least in Spain, for example, like I think it's still a lot of your talent still goes to those pools, but I think it is changing very rapidly. And actually, if you look at places like in the US now, I think if you look at the MBA, the people that leave MBA 20 years ago versus today, like their actual exit jobs are completely different.
Completely, the landscape has changed massively. Okay, moving into what the hiring process is. So basically, in this new era of AI, we wouldn't be able to not to talk about AI here. How do you think it's reshaping the job market, particularly in terms of the roles in demand? Because that's something that is also changing a lot. And then, how are companies using AI to hire, and how candidates should adapt to this new era?
I think there's a paradigm that's happening. So on the one side, I think you now have business people that are either they're able to sort of like embrace AI and use it on their day-to-day to sort of augment their work, or they're not going to be able to go through the process. So right now, even if I'm actually hiring for a marketing role or for an operational role, I actually make them do sort of like tasks that involve using AI tools. So I really want to know sort of like what's your ability to sort of embrace AI, even if you're a business person and what you're going to do is mostly like actually sort of like business or operations or M&A or growth or whatever it is. On the other side, I think also for the technical roles, it's also changing much more. I think before we would used to think of sort of technical roles as sort of like this geek that's actually sort of in a garage and like doesn't understand anything about business, but it's amazing coding. I think now it's completely opposite. Now sort of coding and everything in AI coding, sort of like helping developers to actually code, has freed up a lot of their time. And I think now actually there's a much more common role, which is sort of the product engineer.
Yeah.
Before you had sort of like product management people, which were like ex-consultants or ex sort of like startup people that were doing like product management roles. And then you have sort of your engineering team. Now, for example, us at the company, basically everybody that's technical, it's a product engineer. Like you need to be able to think of what's the problem and how to solve it and how to code it.
Yeah.
Like it's the same person full stack that needs to be able to do those 3 steps instead of sort of creating the bureaucracy. So I think it's really changed the landscape. At the end of the day, it's like more and more sort of the jobs are actually sort of like converging to an extent.
Yeah.
The differentiation between who's technical, who's not technical, I think
It doesn't really matter.
It doesn't really matter anymore. Or is it yes, especially if you go to like highly, like deeply, someone that's creating like AI models, I think it's very different. But for like, let's call it 99% of the startups or the tech scene, which is more sort of on the application layer.
Yeah.
I think it is converging much more and more sort of how business and the technology teams actually work together.
Thank you so much for this. Going back to when you were interviewing at GoPuff, how is the interview process like? How do you remember it to be structured?
I was the first employee, so it was it was still structured. Basically, I think the first call I was with the CEO and co-founder. I think out of 1 hour call, he spoke 55 minutes. He was a very intense dude. And it was very interesting because they were not looking necessarily for like the smartest person, but they were looking about passion.
Yeah.
So actually part of me getting in and sort of being the first employee is I
was
took
to
a
be
flight.
extremely motivated.
It was the middle of COVID and I took a flight from one day to the other without sort of like, even though there were a lot of restrictions, and basically went to his house in London and be like, hey dude, I want to join.
Yeah.
So
but that's what makes
the difference.
Yeah, exactly.
So it wasn't a very structured process. I did have sort of like a case study actually after that anyway. But it was more about like sort of like being crisp, the passion, sort of the speed at which you were answering. At the end of the day, they had raised a lot of money. They had very limited people that you could actually get on board, sort of the first 5 to 10 people.
Yeah.
And it was more about showing that willingness to break walls.
Okay. And when you were interviewing other candidates among your career, what's something that for you is essential for candidates to stand out, apart from getting a flight and,
I think, so it's very interesting. I don't usually me specifically, I don't assess usually anything on the hard skill side. I usually focus on 4 pillars, which is passion and ambition, curiosity and trust.
Okay.
For me, it's like, hey, are you passionate about what you are going to be doing? I think like a lot of people, they just want to like basically join a job because of one sort of like something that they're actually chasing to an extent, and they think like they love to do that, but the reality is they're not really passionate about that. And I think that really makes the difference, specifically in tough times, which I think is the reality. There's no company that always is straight up into the right. I mean, very few. So I think you need to make sure that you're passionate about what you do, if you really, or that you have a passion and you're not gonna hate it sort of like day 10.
And during an interview, how do you test the passion?
I go really deep into sort of like what moves them. I talk much more about sort of like what do they actually enjoy, how do they grow up.
Yeah, no, I fully understand. When I was interviewing for Google like 10 years ago, it's really surprised me that there is one interview process that they call Googliness.
Okay.
And basically, I studied a lot for the Google interview. I showed a lot of passion and commitment. But it shocked me that for 45 minutes, this guy was asking me about acting, because I went for an acting school, and 45 minutes asking me questions about, how I developed those skills and how I moved to New York. And I thought it was going to be much more technical. And it ended up being, like him testing how much I could do for something that I'm passionate about. So I found it very interesting.
Yeah, but I think like a lot of those things, you can test them exactly much more getting into, hey, like what does your day-to-day look like outside of work?
Yeah.
What made you make that decision? Why did you study? Like, it's very interesting. You asking when you're in an interview many times, and I'm like, hey, why did you study history? And maybe there's someone that now is like 35 years old, and they're like, oh, why are you asking me this? Like nobody's really asked me that. And I'm like, oh, it's important. Like, what was your thought process?
Yeah.
Like, how were you making decisions?
No, 100%.
Why did you switch from this job to this job? Like, what were you chasing?
Yeah.
And I think that really sort of like tells you a lot about the truth, sort of like deep motivation and passion of that person specifically.
100%. And also it can give you a lot of information about someone that you wouldn't like to hire, depending on...
Totally. They're like, oh no, yeah, because my parents told me. Oh, okay, good. Thank
Or
you.
no, because they offer me more money, which is something that I hear a lot, and it's just a no-go for me.
Exactly.
Okay, so looking back, where do you think candidates should turn for solid interview prep? Because, for example, for me, building the network with with time is fundamental, and asking questions and researching. It's a very solid prep. But what else could a candidate do?
I think you can show value. I think it's something very few candidates
Yeah.
do. But for example, it's happened to me now as an employer, and I also did it sort of as a potential employee. For example, actually, when I went into VC, I actually went into the venture capital company that I wanted to join. I was like, hey, this is your portfolio. This is the things that I've seen you invest in. I've actually researched this 50 companies. I think you should invest in this one. And I gave them a lot of data set, and I kept on sort of chasing them with that. Like, hey, I'm actually showing you that I know how to do the work. The way I was completely wrong in the way I was assessing it, but at least I was
So it
trying to
doesn't
show
matter. It's
value.
the skill
Exactly.
that you're willing to show value, and that's called attitude as well. Like in terms of how attitude makes a difference.
And it just happened to me actually the other way around. So we actually just hired a guy that he came to me, and he was basically chasing me on LinkedIn and then on different sort of platforms. And he's like, hey, David, I've seen what you're doing. I'm in love because of this, and this reason. And by the way, have you looked at this, and that company that you could actually acquire?
Yeah.
So, and that guy, I'm like, okay, I'm going to listen to you.
Okay, so what more qualities do you think help to stand out as a candidate, apart from being proactive, motivated, and giving an extra mile?
Well, that's already a lot, huh? What other things you could do? It's one is I think showing ambition, making sure that culturally that ambition is actually there. I think when you really want to work in fast-paced environments, you really need to make sure that you're aligned with sort of that fast pace, which usually comes with a huge ambition that you have. So I think that's very critical to really understand. A lot of people, if they're like, oh no, I want to come here, but I want you to tell me you want to be the CEO of this business.
Yeah.
That's what I'm looking to hear when you're in a startup.
It's interesting because when students reach out to us, they're very worried about their lack of experience. And we tell them many times that most of the hiring processes are going to look into what we're speaking, right? Motivation, attitude, and all these efforts to stand out rather than experience. So you agree with that statement, right?
Totally. Totally. I think experience is completely useless, especially when you're starting, because the reality is you don't know anything. And actually, maybe that's a good point in terms of a tip. I think people that they show confidence, they're even a little bit arrogant to an extent, but they also know when to say, hey, I don't know. And they're not trying to sort of yesterday I had a terrible interview, actually. Someone that was completely bluffing her way through.
That's amazing, because my next question is, what are the common mistakes and what are your no-goes? So it's related to what you're going to say. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, for me, it's hey, when you're empty, when you ask questions and you clearly don't know them because of whatever reason, and you just start to basically saying fluff around that answer. For me, it's okay, that's a no-go, because that's going to tell me a lot of the way you're going to interact at work.
Yeah.
Is that every time you're not going to do something, you're not going to be able to reflect and say, hey, I'm going to raise my hand. I don't know how to do this.
Yeah, and also, spoiler alert, we smell the bluff. Totally. So it's very easy to identify.
It's super easy, and especially if you're someone that once you've interviewed a lot, it's very easy when you go deep. People that are empty, you see it straight away.
Yeah. When we interview, what we try to actually do is when they prepare examples on behavioral questions, for example, testing a certain experience, what we do is we ask a lot of questions on the same example.
McKinsey is amazing at this.
If it's a fluff, it's just going to be so obvious from the very beginning, and that you just risked everything because it's a massive no-go. What else is a no-go for you?
I think there's a lot of hygiene factors, for example, that but surprisingly a lot of people still don't do it, which is very good because they make your job easier. You just don't even call them for an interview. But I think it's people that, for example, they ask about comp very early on.
Yeah.
Sort of I'm like, okay, this is weird.
The type of questions that you ask are going to define the person that you are. That's 100% sure.
So I think that's one. I think probably the second one is, even not asking questions. There's people that go to, at the end of the day, an interview, it's a little bit like flirting, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you need to make sure that you play a little bit hardball, and like you also put yourself and your values sort of like you put your values sort of on the table, but at the same time you need to give. I
Yeah.
think you see a lot of people that go into interviews a little bit with like too much of like receiving mode. And I think like for any relationship to work, it usually needs to be sort of bidirectional.
Yeah.
So I think that's also no go for me. Like there's a lot of people, especially like people that are very smart, very qualified. Sometimes they go into sort of some
They can be arrogant. Yeah.
yes. And like I don't mind a little bit of arrogance, but like again, it's like flirting. Like
Yeah.
we all like a little bit the bad girl, the bad boy. Like you like it a little bit, but
Yeah.
like when you're too much, we're like, okay, you're an idiot. You're not a bad
100%.
girl.
100%. For me, the no-goes also start even before the interview process, in the sense that people hear you need to build your network, you need to do a proactive approach on job hunting strategies, which is something that we also teach in our packages, in our courses. And something that for me is a no-go is getting a message on LinkedIn, basically treating me like I have to apply for you. So the messages that you send, building your network, are also going to determine if
Totally.
people are going to help you or not. And believe it or not, I would say 70% of the messages that I receive are a no-go. So it starts not only in the interview, but in how you build a network, how you approach the opportunities, and so on. Okay, do we have more no-goes? The questions that you ask, the attitude, the not being prepared, of course.
Yes. I mean, there's a lot of like hygiene factors. Okay, yeah,
Like obvious
maybe
stuff, yeah.
I'm afraid of like stating obvious stuff, which we mentioned before starting. But like, yeah, I think like there's a lot of hygiene factors of like, hey, show up very prepared, like making sure that you're on time, like making sure that you have like a battery of questions of stuff that you want to get out. Like
Yeah.
at the end of it, I love deal making, more on the business side, but I think like hiring and sort of like applying for a job is very similar. At the end, you're trying to strike a deal.
Yeah.
You know what you wanna, you know what you want. You need to understand what the other person wants.
Yeah, it's.
And you need to make sure that you find that match.
Do you think companies do a good job making you feel that this is a bilateral relationship?
I mean, I cannot speak about like I've only worked at like 3-4 companies, but like I think we try to do it. Like at the end of the day, I actually said always at the beginning, like let's make sure this is bidirectional.
Yeah.
I am extremely harsh, actually. Even I overact it sometimes in terms of what the culture looks like. What am I looking for? I'm extremely sort of like straight about all of those things, even to the point that I try to scare a little bit.
Yeah.
For people that are a little bit sort of on the gray line, they're like, okay, maybe I don't want to work with this guy.
Yeah.
And it's happened to me, by the way. Like a lot of people that were amazing on paper, they probably had all the credentials, even sort of the cultural fit to an extent.
Yeah.
But they were on like, oh, I don't know if I really want to work that hard. I really don't know if I want like sort of this guy on my neck every day. And then they ended up sort of like dropping out.
Yeah.
I
No,
call it
100%.
self-selection. I think
Yeah,
it's the best.
We always tell them to like, that we make sure that they understand that it's bilateral and that they don't go afraid to interviews. That they also, we see a lot of students afraid to negotiate an offer, for example. And for me,
I don't negotiate with anybody though. But I
that's
like that
good.
people try to negotiate.
Exactly, but that's the thing. Like most of the
Yes.
times, the offer is going to be unnegotiable, especially in your early years. But I appreciate a lot when at least they try.
I love it.
Even with, I always say, like, if the fix and the variable and the equity or whatever is unnegotiable, at least show me that you can negotiate the starting date.
It's like when you're fundraising.
Just give me something.
The way you show, the way you execute the deal, the way you pressure the right people at the right time, I think it really tells. Even though, like, most of the time you're not going to get 80% of the things you're asking for, and then you're going to need to settle somewhere in between. I think that's sort of like grit.
Yeah. Good. Okay, one question. How important are CVs for you? Because people are very worried about CVs. And I think we're moving into an era that, you need to stand out in different ways. But if we have to stick to the CV, how important is it to you? How much importance do you give to a designed CV or a structured? Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think like everything in life, like it's probably parametric. It really depends on sort of like the stage of your career. I think probably if you're straight out of uni, your CV, your network is going to be much more limited. Your experience by default is going to be much more limited. So whatever you're going to be able to show on a piece of paper is actually going to be, and the way you're going to present yourself, it's going to be valued much more than sort of like later in your career, which what I want to value is how many people can I get references from you that I actually know and where you've worked. And do I know if that place actually has sort of a culture that I admire or not? So I think like that CV and sort of like how people are going to judge you based on what you've done really sort of changes throughout your career. I think obviously as you get older and older, it's more like, hey, can people actually vouch for you? Can people sort of reference you?
I know, 100%.
And your CV in itself, like, yeah, maybe you read it on LinkedIn.
Yeah, no, and at our age, I doubt that the next hiring process that we will face, if we face one, it will be a very structured one. So it develops.
It develops totally over time. But no, but you, I mean, yeah, I think even at a lot of senior positions, like you still, like with us, even like super senior people, you still go through like a very like structured process.
Yeah.
But I think like what puts value sort of like to get into that process, it's more usually an intro.
Yeah.
Or it's getting referenced by someone, or like it's not like I'm going to look at your CV beyond looking at LinkedIn.
No, 100%.
I'm going through like all of the bullet points of how you've presented what you've actually done in sort of your internship, which I think it's much more valuable sort of in the early stages of your career. For example, I do value a lot like how quickly you've been able to move within within that same company in terms of like how you've been able to progress. Yes, totally. Okay. It really shows sort of the hunger and the ambition. And when you see people that have been able to do fast tracks at like large organizations, like, okay, this guy is probably like top 5%.
Good. If you had to tell the audience, imagine, you're 24, 25 years right now. What is the best advice that you got back when you were starting your career? Which one would it be?
I think it's actually not to move on. And I think it's actually something that our generation, especially I think the upcoming generations are facing more and more, which is I think we switch jobs much more like early on.
As
like
a way of the promotion.
The moment there's something that, I didn't get promoted, or, this didn't happen. I think we're like, okay, let me go to the next place. Let me chase the next sort of like big logo or place that I want to join. I think, and it's something that I think from our parents' generation that we're basically for like 40 years at the same company. I think my biggest sort of like thing that they told me is somewhere in between. Like, I think you do need to sort of do a job for at least like 4 to 5 years. I think switching a lot in your first like 2, 3, 4 years.
Yeah, it can be seen as a red flag in the first early years.
I do think so. I do think that being able, I mean, it's okay if you choose one place and you completely hated it. It happened to me.
No, but I fully understand what you're saying. I mean, I have 3 logos on my CV. The last one, 4 years and a half. But if I see a CV or I'm interviewing someone in very early careers with 3 experiences, the 3 of them with less than 10, 11 months in each one of them, for me, like, it's going to raise questions in my head.
Totally. So, exactly. I think like, and it's sort of one of the best sort of career advices because it happened to me. And I think it happens to a lot of ambitious people. But like, I think like intelligence and ego are correlated to like a certain point. Then really intelligent people are able to educate their ego. So I think it sort of really happened to me that I was basically at Dija. So we started the business, first employee, amazing, ended up being GM of Spain, expanding, a lot of people under me, like crazy revenue, all of those things. Then we sold the business. I had only spent there like a year. And it was all been super, super fast. And I was like, okay, I'm going to quit and build my own business. And someone basically told me like, hey, David, like, I think you don't know shit. And it's actually true. Like, I learned much more probably in the following sort of like 3-4 years there, which were much tougher, less cool, but you've learned much more of sort of having seen something, because even though we now live in a world that moves faster and faster, and I think we all agree with that. I think there's still some fundamental pieces, and our brains, even though they might move very fast for some things, I think for taking learnings, especially like sort of career learnings, you need to have seen much more, and there's a function of time.
But at the same time, it has to be a bilateral within the company. Like, the company also has to work on retaining talent, right?
Yes.
Do you think they do a good job in that?
I think it really depends on the company. So I think in companies there's a lot of self-selection early on. Like, I think you clearly see in like I think the problem is people that they don't fire fast enough in companies. But like the reality is like within 5 to 6 months you already know if this is somewhere where you want to spend 1 year, 2 years, or you're actually going to go for longer. I think what happens is usually the smaller the organization, the less objective actually it ends up being sort of the people you want to retain, versus I think in larger organizations you have much more sort of measurable processes that allow you to sort of be able to retain your top talent or the people that you think are your top talent. The only problem is it involves a little bit more politics. Yeah. But it's probably much more objective than subjective in sort of like smaller companies. Yeah. where it's basically just a much more subjective process overall, because it's fewer people, and you tend to basically sometimes really retain the people that are needed to do something specifically, not because they're the people
The
that
ones
have
that are
the
going to
best,
drive the growth. Yeah,
exactly, and have the
absolutely
biggest
agree.
potential.
Going back to probably my last question, but I think this is
Only okay.
Eh?
That was quick.
Yeah. But you just raised a really good point in terms of how to succeed in a company. Obviously depends on the company, but if you would have to give like 2-3 tips, and also to navigate the politics of a big corporation in this case.
I think like one is by working harder, you're already sort of going to outpace 80% of the people sort of in your cohort.
Yeah.
I think like a lot of people don't understand that, but like at the end of the day, like it is mathematical. Like if you work more hours, you're able to usually like push much more harder, especially on the early days. Like in the type of work that you're getting out the door, the harder you work, usually the further you're going to be able to get in the early days. I think the second one is being able to like really sort of like cross walls. I think like, again, to like showing value, doing things that taking the next step.
Okay.
Like being that proactive, I think that's really sort of what puts you on the map versus someone that doesn't. So I don't know, imagine when I was in venture capital, I was an analyst, and it was like my job was not to do fundraising. But if I had the chance to get an LP through the door to Jose and I was like, I'm gonna get you an LP. I'm gonna get you an investor through the door. Like, and I tried to organize 10 meetings. I think only one worked. But like, I think just trying to do things that, although they're not of your specific stage, but that you're doing on top of your day-to-day work, I think all of those things are the things that are really going to differentiate you versus everybody else.
Yeah.
So I think one is just work harder and making sure that everything you do with a degree of excellence that is top-notch. And at the end of the day, that's usually
very
horsepower.
difficult to find, right?
It is hard to find. It is
very hard to find. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your tips. It was very valuable to have you here. And congrats on what you're doing.
Thank you.